The WSL relegation fight was thrown wide open on Sunday after Crystal Palace beat Aston Villa 3-1 to move within 1 point of the relegation rivals and just 3 points behind Leicester City. So what the fuck happened?
It's one of those ones where you're like, is it just down to the new manager, or is it a new manager bounce, or could this have happened had Laura Kaminsky stayed in the role and been given a chance? Without a crystal ball, we'll never know. But, you know, I was watching the first half of it because I was doing the Tottenham-Brighton game. So I was able to catch some of the first half. And I remember thinking, like, Villa looked the better team. More comfortable in possession, creating more opportunities. And then suddenly, Crystal Palace got their goal. And to be able to then put it almost out of touch a little bit by going 2-0 up, you know, like, because Villa did start well. They were rushing things a little bit, you know, shots from distance, and they created 19 but only 3 on target. Like, that's an area that they really need to start working on. Quite toothless in attack in the end. And actually I thought Rachel Daly wasn't maybe as impactful as we're used to seeing her. I'd be really intrigued to know, like, when they played Manchester City in the FA Cup and she was on the bench for the first half along with Jordan Nobbs and Kirsty Hansen. I just think, like, did that come back to haunt them a little bit, you know? Ebony Salmon looked like she's a bright spark. She looked good. But yeah, they're just not taking their chances. And then for Crystal Palace to get the set piece and get a goal, and Anique Nohan as well scoring on her debut. She, like, 470 days away from football, I think it is, after an ACL injury. Was pretty impressive. And speaking of injuries, like, Palace had injuries as well. They had 3 academy players on the bench. No Lexi Potter or Josie Green, which I think makes the win all the more impressive. So yeah, it was very impressive. And I feel like the goals that they got came at the right time and often come at times against Palace. You know, like, when you look back at some of their results and you're like, the opposition always scored like just before half time or just after half time or just at the death where they're drawing. Like, if you think about the last time Palace played Villa and Aston Villa got the winner in 93 minutes and 11 seconds or something. And actually it was the other way around for them this time. So yeah, a real interesting one, because not only does it, you know, make this a relegation battle between them and Aston Villa, it just kind of pulls Leicester down into them a little bit as well, because they're only 3 points off Leicester now.
Doesn't it just? I think we'll touch on the relegation battle at the very end, because I just want to get your thoughts on that. But we kind of keep talking about this bloody new manager bounce. Obviously, both sides have just changed their managers. New Palace manager, Leif Smear's first victory in charge. We do have a question in from Anat on Instagram. Crystal Palace and Liverpool see success and new managers get the credit. Is this deserved, or is this just, you know, an amalgamation of the hard work and effort and graft and dedication to Crystal Palace wanting to put in everything to the last dying minute to make sure that they don't go back into the Championship in the same year?
There's other factors at play, and like, if they continue on this run and they get 2-3 more wins, you can absolutely credit the manager. But, like, you know, it's kind of the same with Liverpool. It's like, to suddenly make a sweeping statement about a new manager can be a bit, it's the same like Nick Cushing. He's only been in there 3 or 4 days. So it does, as I said, have an impact sometimes for the players, because they maybe feel like it takes the pressure off them a little bit. But yeah, Palace are fighting tooth and nail for relegation, and that's why it's hard to know, like, would this result have happened anyway under Laura Kaminsky? It's hard to know, because once that the games get less and less and you get closer and closer to that cliff edge, like, things definitely change within a team. So it's a hard one to lay, not the blame, but lay the successes at a manager's feet just yet. But they stay up, then absolutely.
I think it's, and also what we were saying before about Crystal Palace's form. I know the results haven't, it feels like the results sometimes haven't necessarily reflected the actual work that the girls have been putting in on the pitch. And they've been very close on occasion not to come away with either a cheeky win or at least a draw out of some of the games. So this wasn't a case of, okay, well, Palace have, you know, been absolutely slammed every single game. It's not reflective. So it wasn't necessarily a case that the new manager has come in and completely rejigged things and we saw a completely different Palace, and there was completely, like, it just wasn't. So I think this game probably would have happened even if Laura Kaminsky had been there. I think they were probably due a game where things just clicked a little bit, and on a day where things with Aston Villa didn't click. But then when you look at kind of where both of the teams are now, so Aston Villa, both teams play the same amount of games, 16 games. Aston Villa sitting on 10 points, Crystal Palace on 9 points. Aston Villa have a goal difference of -16 with Crystal Palace on -25. Both teams have only won 2 games, and Aston Villa are only ahead because they've drawn 4 and Crystal Palace have drawn 3. I mean, when you look at, you wouldn't ever look at, it's a weird one because when you actually compare the stats like that, you think, well, Crystal Palace are literally, they're exactly the same position as a team like Aston Villa that have had, what 4 years in the WSL, which is kind of, to Palace's credit, pretty flipping good. I mean, Rach, what do you think? This is not a team that should be anywhere near the bottom of the league like this.
It's a bit of a conundrum, to be honest. Because the beginning of the season, at times they were playing some good football. I think back to that first game where they played Chelsea and they looked really good. And I think everyone was kind of saying, okay, wow, they've got a good manager here. They've got good players who are understanding what they want to do. And then they just seemed to, they were really poor in defence at times, not being effective enough in front of goal at times. And then obviously had that interim period under Sean Goater, and then got in the new manager in Italia. And like that FA Cup game where they played Brighton and knocked them out, like they played some nice football. And I remember thinking, they played Chelsea as well, if you remember, they only just lost that 1-0. So sometimes, in their case as well, the results don't necessarily reflect the game itself. And I think for a lot of these teams, it is that effectiveness and that quality in front of goal that ultimately loses them games, because they create the moments and they create the chances, and the ability to be switched on in defence for 90 minutes is difficult. Like, you can attest to that. I know it sounds like a really obvious thing that you should be able to do, but when you're playing against top quality opposition and you're out of possession and it's tiring and you need to be moving as one unit, one person switches off for a second, it can be the thing that loses you the game, which sounds quite dramatic. But when you look back at some of their results, that is often the case. So it is quite a tough one to figure out, because there were some signs of some good stuff under Natalia, and this was a really surprising one. But maybe it shouldn't be, given it was so close the last time they played.
Well, and also, I mean, this defeat for Aston Villa follows a 3-0 loss against Leicester City and a 2-0 defeat at home to Everton. 5 league defeats in a row for Natalia. Things aren't looking great. And I think, had Crystal Palace not been so put together such a bad run of form an understandable bad run of form, it's very hard to compete when you're first into the WSL for the first season, when you've got the players that you do and the budget that you do. But the damage that it would cause by having Aston Villa go back into the Championship is not, it would be absolutely awful. I think when you look at kind of like the exposure that WSL gets you in terms of the TV exposure, when you think about even the kind of revenue that's generated from being a part of the WSL with a 75-25% revenue split now with the WPLL, like financially it's not great, and I just don't think that is where the club should be heading, given the size and the budget and the players that they have. It would be catastrophic, I think. Budget
isn't huge, and I do think they need to invest more on the pitch. Like, they're making good moves where they're playing the games at Villa Park, which is great, but when you think back to that run last year with Carla Ward at the beginning of the season, and everything looked disastrous because they were down in 8th and 9th and at the beginning of the season, and they'd faced Chelsea and Arsenal and Manchester City, and the kind of murmurings around that, that doesn't seem to be there this year, and I'm not advocating for a kind of, don't get me wrong, any manager sackings or anything. We've already had that. But I just think it's interesting, because sometimes that reaction of sacking a manager is a way for a club to say, look, we really care. We've made a really big decision here, and that's going to fix everything. And actually, that's not necessarily the thing that's going to fix everything. You need to be investing more with players and getting players in who can finish those chances and be more, clinical in front of goal, or more switched on in defence, or whatever that might be. But then equally, it does take time for a new manager to impart their wisdom and their style of play. So it is difficult as a new manager when you come in at the time that she came in the position that they're in, and it is tight down the bottom. Definitely. You're getting Leicester dragged into it now as well. And West Ham then are only 3 points above Leicester, I believe, and 15. So it's tight enough, and all those games are going to be really bloody interesting. And they're the games I want to be seeing on TV, because relegation matters, in case we haven't talked about it enough, and relegation is exciting, and this is proving that.
100%. And I think talking about the battle now, it looks obviously a little bit spicier than it did a week ago. Crystal Palace have games against Everton, West Ham and Leicester before the end of the season, which is really good for them, which is really fucking exciting. Like, anything could literally happen. I mean, if we're going to put our flagpoles in the sand now about relegation, what are we saying, Rach? Do we feel, who would you say? Do we think Crystal Palace might just be the lucky bastards who have sat at the bottom of the table pretty much the entire season and pulled a miraculous fucking rabbit out of a hat last minute?
Well, listen, if Portsmouth are anything to go by in the Championship, who've been rooted to the bottom of the table with no wins for absolutely ages and are now sitting in ninth this weekend with 2 wins on the bounce, like, I think things might get tighter. I think maybe more teams might get pulled into that. West Ham are playing Tottenham next weekend. Brighton are playing Leicester, I think. So, you know, all those games in and around it, kind of from fourth below, actually, are really quite difficult to call. You know, you've got the likes of Everton now who are starting to find a little bit of form. Granted, they lost to Arsenal, but they did play well for much of the game, and they always look dangerous now going forward. And they used to look dangerous going forward before, but didn't really have the finishers, and they're starting to get that now. So it just makes things a little bit more spicy. You had Brighton kind of finding their form again against Chelsea, Tottenham finding their form against Manchester City, then came together and played one of the dullest games of football. Like, it's really hard to call because teams are so inconsistent. So I do think we'll have maybe another team or two dragged into that relegation battle, and it could get very, very interesting as the season goes on.
Rach, I haven't heard you put your flagpole in the sand, if I'm being quite honest.
Oh, I'm just going to stick with what I said at the beginning of the season. I'm not going to change my mind, and that was Palace, but it's going to be close.
I think they're going to do it. There's like a cheeky part of Palace that I don't. Maybe that's because I'm just like a little bit biased with them being much women's. Like a little. But I do feel like, I don't know, now they've got that win under the belt, and now it does feel like they've been thrown a life raft. You can pull yourself out, lads.
Hold on to it, guys.
You can do this. Get yourself to safety and survive another year, please.